Part 1. Restore Historic Palestine. End Zionist Apartheid. Millions of people across the planet see that Zionism is the ideology that perpetuates racism, apartheid, and genocide. As protests surge across the U.S. and the rest of the world against Israel's genocide in Gaza, with polls indicating 68% of people in the U.S. support a ceasefire, a call to end Zionist apartheid and restore free Palestine emerged at the United Nations in New York, November 20th, 2023. A contingent of true Talmud Jews carried signs saying Judaism condemns the state of Israel and its atrocities, and protesters held placards saying "Land back, restore historic Palestine, and from the river to the sea, single state now." This slogan is not anti-Semitic, but, as Representative Rashida Tlaib declared, is an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence. The group delivered a petition signed by 15 organizations and hundreds of individuals addressed to the UN, all relative officials and deliberative bodies, to revoke the UN partition plan of 1947, which created the State of Israel. The petition said the British mandate for Palestine at the end of World War I was never valid, and Israel's current escalation of ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Palestinian people of Gaza and the West Bank should be ended. It should be replaced by a single state, a unified nation that respects the rights, voices, and safety of all, regardless of religion or ethnicity. The call was an echo of the anti-apartheid movement against the racist colonial state of South Africa, which led to its dissolution in 1994, when African National Congress leader Nelson Mandela became president of the new Republic of South Africa. The parallels between the two struggles are many, including stubborn official U.S. government support and alliance with both racist regimes, which faced decades of struggle by the indigenous people of both countries, with intense and ever-growing worldwide solidarity. The petition presented to the UN November 20th includes the following demands: an immediate Israeli ceasefire, open the Rafah crossing to bring in medical aid and fuel supplies for hospitals in Gaza, worldwide aid to Gaza refugees, free all Palestinian political prisoners held in Israeli jails, end all aid to Israel, military and otherwise, freeze all Israeli assets held in foreign banks, cut off all trade to Israeli-held companies, demand Israel immediately dismantle and surrender all weapons of mass destruction in its possession, nuclear, biological, and chemical. It also calls for the arrest of Prime Minister Netanyahu, his immediate cabinet, leading members of the Israeli Defense Force, and any or all U.S. officials complicit in Israel's war crimes. It says such individuals must be remanded to the International Criminal Court for prosecution in the spirit of the 1945-46 Nuremberg trials. The petition says the UN should facilitate the creation of a new single Palestinian state, with recognition of the right of return to all Palestinians, including refugees from the Nakba who currently reside in other nations, as enshrined in UN Resolutions 194 and 302. There should be land restitution to all Palestinians, either in land or monetary compensation, and full and equal citizenship to all Palestinians in the new nation. There should be an enforceable timetable for enacting new elections and a new constitution for the new nation, including a Bill of Rights with universal guarantees for all citizens, regardless of ethnicity, race, or religion. All illegal settlements would be removed. In the interest of diversity and peace, current anti-Zionist Israeli citizens would not be expelled from the new nation's borders, but rather encouraged to stay and help rebuild should they so choose. The UN has condemned settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories in multiple resolutions, declaring them to be illegal under international law. How could so many have stayed silent? As a Jewish kid, said the petition's author, Janet, of the Bronx Anti-War Coalition, I often heard the question asked in my synagogue, how could so many have stayed silent during the Holocaust? What we're seeing now is a Holocaust wreaked by Israel, and what they do now has nothing to do with Jewish values. Zionists do not, and never did, speak for us. She added, the constant refrain we hear now is ceasefire. That's vital, but not enough. We need to address the cause itself. If we don't, I guarantee Israel and the U.S. government, Democrat and GOP, will use a ceasefire to claim everything's fixed and sweep the continuing Holocaust of Palestinians under the rug. If that happens, the death and suffering will continue. She called the two-state solution a fraud, an attempt to institutionalize past injustice which enables more violence by Israel. Israel has never been serious about two states. They admit that in rhetoric you hear from Zionists calling for greater Israel, and two-state denies Palestinians the right to return. Separate but equal doesn't work. We in the U.S. know what an injustice that is. Stolen land deserves restitution. All Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and refugees in other nations have a right to return home to historic Palestine and be granted equal citizenship and rights. Rabbi David Weiss of True Talmud Jews said, we feel a religious duty to denounce the state of Israel, adding that for 3,000 years, Jews and Arabs lived side by side in peace before the Zionists invaded. Without Zionist state violence, Jews and Arabs can live in peace in a democratic, secular Palestine, he said. Israel's one-state reality, a la Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs, the flagship publication of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, ran a major article in April 2023 titled Israel's One-State Reality. It's time to give up on the two-state solution. It said Netanyahu's extreme right-wing government has shattered even the illusion of a two-state solution. It added that the temporary status of occupation of the Palestinian territories is now a permanent condition in which one state ruled by one group of people rules over another group of people. The Foreign Affairs article says a one-state arrangement is not a future possibility. It already exists, no matter what anyone thinks. Between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, one state controls the entry and exit of people and goods, oversees security, and has the capacity to impose its decisions, laws, and policies on millions of people without their consent. It notes that Netanyahu has written that Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather of the Jewish people, and only it. The man he appointed as Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has declared that Gaza should be ours and that the Palestinians can go to Saudi Arabia or other places like Iraq or Iran. Israel's one-state reality, the Foreign Affairs article says, reveals a situation of apartheid. The term refers to the system of racial segregation that South Africa's white minority government used to enforce white supremacy from 1948 to the early 1990s. It has since been defined under international law and by the International Criminal Court as a legalized scheme of racial segregation and discrimination and deemed a crime against humanity. Major human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have applied the term to Israel. So have many academics. End quote. The Foreign Affairs article says the United States bears considerable responsibility for the one-state reality. So far, the article says, the Biden administration has sought to sustain the status quo while urging Israel to avoid major provocations. That could be considered accurate in April 2023 when this article was published. But now, the Netanyahu government is committing genocide in Gaza, and the Biden administration is supporting it with weapons and vetoing calls at the UN for a ceasefire. This is not what most people in the United States want. The article says polls show that most American voters would support a democratic Israel over a Jewish one. The authors say the Israeli-Palestinian issue is increasingly viewed as an issue of social justice rather than strategic interest or biblical prophecy. This has been particularly true in the era of Black Lives Matter. Legal action to block U.S. aid to Israeli genocide. In mid-November 2023, the Center for Constitutional Rights brought an emergency motion in U.S. federal court to force President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to stop providing weapons, money, and military and diplomatic support to Israel as it is committing genocide in Gaza. Quote, our Palestinian clients are asking the court to urgently order Biden, Blinken, and Austin to stop supporting Israel's genocide, said Maria Lahoud, CCR's deputy legal director. The report by Marjorie Cohn, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, appeared November 19th in Truth Out. The complaint alleges violations of the Genocide Convention, the Genocide Convention Implementation Act, and customary international law, which forbids genocide. Plaintiffs include Defense for Children International, Palestine, Al-Haq, 3 Palestinian individuals who reside in Gaza, and 5 Palestinian Americans who have family in Gaza. Public statements by Israeli leaders constitute evidence of an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national group, the report says. Senior Israeli officials and politicians have called Palestinians in Gaza human animals and children of darkness and refused to distinguish between civilians and combatants. The New York Times reported that calls for Gaza to be flattened, erased, or destroyed have been mentioned about 18,000 times since October 7th in Hebrew posts on X, formerly known as Twitter. In addition to supplying huge amounts of military hardware to Israel as it commits genocide, the U.S. government is supporting and guiding the Israeli military effort. Department of Defense's Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh admitted that Defense Department and other officials, quote, all the way up to the president, have certainly informed and at least guided some of what the Israelis are doing on the ground in their ground operation, end quote, the legal complaint says. U.S. officials refuse to place any limitations on Israel's use of U.S. military aid. On November 7th, Singh admitted that we don't put conditions on weapons that we're sending or that Israel is using, and Biden continues to refuse to call for a ceasefire. On November 9th, when asked at a press briefing about the chances of a ceasefire, he replied, none, no possibility. Can there be a permanent ceasefire? A November 23, 2023 New York Times report said the Qatari government announced a pause in fighting to include an exchange of 150 Palestinian political prisoners for 50 non-military Israeli hostages, as well as the entry of hundreds of trucks of humanitarian aid into the besieged Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, the Palestine Information Center reported November 23rd that approximately 1,000 boats have gathered in Turkey November 22nd before heading toward Gaza in an attempt to break the Israeli blockade. Organizers said the boats will carry 4,500 people from 40 countries, including anti-Zionist Jews. The flotilla is part of a massive international campaign to force a permanent ceasefire. Quote, the steadfast resilience and resistance of the Palestinian people has delivered a 4-day pause in the ongoing genocide while securing the imminent release of 150 Palestinian political prisoners, said an early December statement signed by the Palestinian Youth Movement, National Students for Justice in Palestine, the People's Forum, Answer Coalition, and the International People's Assembly. The groups have called on people to remain in the streets around the world to ensure that a permanent ceasefire is reached. We must intensify our commitment and efforts until every single one of our demands is fulfilled. A permanent ceasefire, an end to the siege on Gaza, and an end to all U.S., Canadian, and European aid to Israel. International NGOs are also pushing for a more permanent ceasefire. Joel Weiler, executive director of Médecins du Monde, said for a medical organization, 4 days of pause is Band-Aid, not health care. Médecins du Monde is Doctors of the World, or Doctors Without Borders. Weiler argued it would be insufficient time for treatment of serious injuries. Danila Dzidzi, Handicap International Director for Palestine, said it's a kind of drop in the ocean if we don't have fuel and we don't have access. The only way to meet all these needs, or respect for human rights and access to health care, is a permanent, sustained cessation of humanitarian law violations and a ceasefire long enough to restore human rights to millions of people, said Paul O'Brien, Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. That's why we're joining this call for an immediate and sustained ceasefire. Mass pressure to stop the genocide is escalating. Activists in Tacoma, Washington, scaled the entrance of a ship in early November to stop weapons shipments to Israel after people in Oakland gathered to slow down the ship. Indigenous activists used canoes to interfere with the ship, one of dozens of ships carrying U.S. weapons to apartheid Israel. Similar actions have taken place in many other countries. Meanwhile, university administrations across the country have waged a campaign of repression against students calling for an end to Israeli genocide, calling it anti-Semitic. Electronic Intifada, a voice of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, reports a campaign of intimidation, especially against university students who have been called anti-Semite and terrorist supporter for mobilizing for a ceasefire. Raising our voices requires a calculation of risk, the report said. Will I be slandered? Will I be prosecuted? Will I be suspended? Will I be fired? Will my job offer be rescinded? Will I be denied tenure? All of these things have happened, but the Solidarity Movement continues to grow stronger. It is in this atmosphere that the petition to abolish apartheid Israel and restore historic Palestine has emerged. It's a movement that will not be stopped. Millions of people across the planet see that Zionism is the ideology that perpetuates racism, apartheid, and genocide. The solution is to reverse the U.S.-European settler project in Palestine and restore a democratic, secular Palestine where Arabs and Jews can live together in peace.